And now it's time for the session. I will be giving the floor to our moderator. Please welcome Dakshayini.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time to join this session about COVID-19, the surveillance industry and border policing. So I'm joining you from Sydney, Australia, from the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And before we begin, I'd just like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And also just express solidarity for all the First Nations leaders advocating right now to stop black deaths in custody and also fighting for land rights at this time. So my name's Dakshayini Suryakumaran. I'm a Tamil woman. I'm the Human Rights and Racial Justice Director at the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility. So just for background, the ACCR is a research and shareholder advocacy organisation. So we focus mainly on listed companies and explore how investors are managing climate, labour and human rights issues. So I'll be your moderator for this 6-minute session. And we're very lucky to be hearing from the powerhouse panelists today that will be speaking about a very critically important and very timely topic. So yeah, during what feels like a bit of a reckoning with colonial and imperial histories, which of course form the basis and foundation of the global economy that businesses operate within, what better time to kind of venture into this conversation about race, about technology, border policing and COVID-19. So just to give you a feeling of what you'll be hearing about and the structure of the session. So we'll be covering topics such as what are the human rights abuses happening at borders resulting from these kinds of technologies like artificial intelligence, biometrics, etc. We'll be hearing a bit about how COVID-19 has accelerated the development and growth of this surveillance industry. And finally, we'll look at how some of these harms associated with these technologies can be addressed. So the structure of this session, we'll hear from all of the incredible panelists briefly, and then we'll move to Q&A. I'll have a few questions that I'll ask myself, and then as mentioned, you can throw questions into the Q&A function and we can ask the panelists to respond to them. So just before we kick off, I just want to briefly kind of give you an introduction to the panelists, just to show just the caliber of panelists that we have. We're really excited and grateful that they're with us. So in order of the way that they will present now, I'll just quickly go through. So first up, we've got Professor Tendai Chiume. In 2017, she was appointed the UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerances. So making her the first woman to serve in the role since its creation in 1993. She has an incredible list of very relevant publications on this topic that I'd like to direct you to. That will be available in the longer bio. So thank you, Tendai, for joining us. We also have Associate Professor Behruz Boushani, a Kurdish and Iranian writer, journalist, scholar, cultural advocate and filmmaker. So Behruz was from 2013 to 2017 a political prisoner incarcerated by the Australian government on Manus Island in PNG, and very recently escaped to New Zealand. So very grateful to have you with us, Behruz. Then we've got Dr. Katrina Wallace, one of the world's most cited experts on artificial intelligence and ethics, the founder of Ethical AI Advisory and also founder and director of Flamingo AI, an artificial intelligence company, and actually the second only woman-led business to list on the Australian Stock Exchange, which is incredible. And finally, Jacinta Gonzalez, an expert in criminalization of Latinx and immigrant communities, who runs the very prominent No Tech for ICE campaign that has taken on tech giants such as Palantir, Amazon, and more recently Thomson Reuters. Jacinta is a senior campaigner and organizer at Mi Gente, which is a member-based organization that's a political home for Latinx and Chicanx people in the US, seeking racial justice, economic justice, gender and climate justice. So yeah, you can see that the lineup we have is incredible. So I will hand over and we'll hear very briefly from each of the speakers in that order. So first up, I'd love to invite Professor Tendai Chiume to speak. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to ACCR for convening such a powerful group of people to speak. And I have to just say at the beginning that unfortunately I can't stay for the duration of the session. So I'm going to love you and leave you, but will absolutely watch the recording because I too need to have my mind expanded by the conversation that we're having. So what I thought I would do is talk a little bit about racism and xenophobia in the context of the pandemic, and then tie that back to emerging digital technologies in the border enforcement context. And as many of you on this call are aware, I know we have people from all over the world. The pandemic has had a number of different effects on racial and ethnic minorities and on immigrant groups as well. On the one hand, it's been clear that the pandemic has exacerbated racist and xenophobic conduct. So attack on people because of their race, their ethnicity, their religion, their immigration status, in ways that seem greater than prior to the pandemic, in part because of the spread of disinformation, because of stigmatization of these groups, even outside of the pandemic context. But I think we're also seeing in the context of the pandemic, just exactly how deep structural racial inequality is and ethnic inequality is as well. So that even if there's spikes and explicit acts of xenophobia and racism, there's also just peeling back of any kind of stories we might tell ourselves that our societies are equal. And this is revealed both in terms of vulnerability of racial and ethnic and minority and even immigrant groups to the pandemic, whether it's because they dominate the essential services or the categories of work that are now being designated essential services, or because they are living in conditions of socioeconomic marginalization that mean that they do not have the luxury of sheltering in place as those kind of measures have been rolled out. And so I've been thinking that one of the things that we're seeing right now is actually the real meaning of things like race and ethnicity, right? We know that race is not a biological category, but rather speaks to a structure of power and a hierarchy according to which different groups experience access to rights. And that hierarchy plays itself out in the context of ethnicity, of religion, and then also immigration status. So in my work as special rapporteur, one of the things that I've been trying to highlight is how with migration and with international migrants, there's a way of talking about those groups as though everybody who is a non-citizen is treated the same way or is subject to the same kind of vulnerabilities. But it's so clear, even in the context of immigration, that the way that harm is apportioned is on a racial and ethnic and a religious basis. And in actual fact, I often think to myself that immigration is sort of where racial discrimination goes to just basically, you know, be amped up on steroids and also be shielded from the law as well. So I'm really glad that this conversation is highlighting or spotlighting the context of border enforcement, because a lot of the violations that take place in that context are racialized or, you know, ethnicized or religious forms of discrimination and intervention. I usually give this example when we think about migrant workers, you know, and then we think about expats. Even those terms themselves just convey implicit racialization, which means that we really have to be thinking about issues to do with discrimination and intolerance when we're thinking about migrants generally. And I think the pandemic has also really laid that bare as well. And there's a lot I think we could say also about what this moment is opening up in terms of advocacy that is on the side of racial justice and racial inequality and racial equality, and what possibilities are arising from there. But I won't go into that. So as I imagine will be evident by the conversation we'll have on this panel, technology is a product of society, right? And there's a way of thinking and talking about technology, including in legal spaces. My background as a lawyer is the one I'm most familiar with. But even in policy context, there's a way of talking about technology as neutral. You know, so it's just this tool that gets applied by good people and by bad people. And so we shouldn't really be scrutinizing the design or even the creation of this technology. And in the work that I've been doing on these issues, and also the output that experts in this area have put out, it's just so clear that that's a false way of understanding the interaction between technology and racial discrimination or any other kind of human rights violation. You know, technology is a product of society, and because of that, it embodies the hierarchies and the inequities that exist within society as well. And so I have a report that I'm going to be presenting to the Human Rights Council at the end of this month, which is on race and emerging digital technologies, or rather racial discrimination and emerging digital technologies, in which I map some of the challenges that arise from the fact that technology itself is embedded in structures of racial discrimination and exclusion. And then I have a second report that will be for the General Assembly, which will focus specifically on the context of border enforcement. And a number of the experts on this panel have been so kind as to make submissions to that. So I want to conclude by saying that I hope that some of these two reports that I've mentioned, when they are out, will be useful to the community that is engaged on this call. In those reports, I focus also on the private sector, which in the context of emerging digital technologies exerts more influence, I would say, than even some individual countries. And so we really have to grapple with what that means. And it means that people in the private sector have to absolutely take the lead on human rights issues. And, you know, in producing these reports, one of the things that I've found is that when we have conversations about human rights and technology, they can focus on privacy, they can focus on freedom of speech and expression, but more needs to be done to really think seriously about equality and non-discrimination norms in this space, because privacy and freedom of speech don't get at all of the kinds of harms that are taking place when we're thinking about these technologies. And it's for this reason that I think human rights can be really powerful. You know, human rights can help us describe the problem, and part of that means drawing on the human rights frameworks to say, you know, some of the dynamics that we're seeing violate prohibitions on racial discrimination, but human rights can also help us think through what solutions we need to be working through. Final comment is to say, one of the things that I imagine will be a theme that comes up on this call is how the pandemic is licensing the spread of technologies and mainstreaming technologies that migrant and refugee groups have been subject to experimentation using, right? So technological interventions that governments have been piloting on migrant and refugee groups with very little scrutiny are now being rolled out in the context of the pandemic, that I think just means this panel could not come at a more timely moment. So with those opening remarks, I hope that the community that is participating in this webinar will find the reports that I'm producing in this space to be helpful. And if people are interested in ways in which they could access those reports, I could share that information with ACCR and maybe make that publicly available to everybody. But thank you so much for doing this really important work.
Thank you. Thank you, Tendai. That was really insightful. I really just want to highlight, I loved what you said about these discourses being kind of dominated by a privacy framing, and how that's just not sufficient to kind of deal with the harms that we're talking about. But yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining us and fitting us into your schedule. And yeah, feel free to leave, but thank you so much. And we'll definitely share your work with all of the participants of this forum. So thank you. Next up, we've got, I'll hand over to Associate Professor Behrouz Boushani to give us his insights. I think you're on mute, Behrouz. I think you might be on mute, sorry.
Yeah, okay.
There you go. Oh, sorry, I think, oh.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Yeah, I would like to say hello to everyone. I think I should mention this because I think it's important point that you already mentioned. I should mention it again. That I was in Manus Prison system for 6 years. So, uh, so I talk on base of my experience. Many people around the world have been in isolation for months, and in many places, people continue to die. The suffering of Black people in the US is increasing under coronavirus. And now the recent video of a police officer murdering George Floyd has become the tipping point, which has led to protest and uprising. These protests have spread around the world and taken on a particular kind of power in Australia due to systemic violence against Indigenous peoples. These events are examples of how security, military, and prison system are connected and how real change need to address them together. The lives and dreams of human beings in prison in Australia's offshore and onshore immigration detention centers, run as for profit businesses, have been totally destroyed with no end in sight. I was in Manus for 7 years. Various companies ran the prison system while I was there. G4S, Transfield, Broad Spectrum. I should mention that this Broad Spectrum and Transfield, it was the same company. They changed the name later. Prisoners were killed and others were injured in very brutal ways. Their lives have been crushed. They were never given access to legal avenues to appeal, and they were never provided acceptable justification for their imprisonment. Protests and campaigns in support of the refugees have not been successful in changing the system. A new strategy and better tactics are necessary. Investors can play their part. What Australia has been doing represents the perverse kind of obstinacy. It is an unjustifiable political program feeding a border industrial complex that ensures the continued incarceration of human beings. Australia is a country where the public and investors are privy to so much damning evidence of violence in these camps, and yet nothing has been done to end this abuse. A new worrying development in the growth of the surveillance industry, which will affect displaced and marginalized people in even more destructive ways. The systems used to govern the prisons on Manus Nauru and onshore share aspects and conditions similar to the current coronavirus situation. First, the shadow of death weighs heavily on the imprisoned refugees for the entire time they are held in these prison camps. From the moment they wake up in the morning until the moment they fall asleep, and even when they are asleep and cough deep within their nightmares. The presence of death is sorry, it's hard to pronounce this word. The omnipresence of death is an inseparable part of life under these detention systems. Every prisoner senses death is different way. No doubt the one who has to deal with a pre-existing illness experience a more destructive form of death. These circumstances represent the threshold a situation where a human being feels they are on a precipice. The situation with the coronavirus is exactly like this. Another point to consider is that the Manus Prison system was founded based on competition and hate. In this system, propped up by companies and their investors, humans have to compete even in order to get something to eat and other basic needs. Otherwise, they will deteriorate or perish. In such circumstances, people are positioned between human and animal. Principles of morality and human values begin to collapse, while there was competition and loathing. The culture of brotherhood always prevailed in Manus Prison. This culture helped us to support each other during periods of collective hunger strikes and other protests. It helped us unite against the system and the companies that profit from them. We use this culture of brotherhood ultimately to enable collective resistance. It is a contradiction, but we're living in this space with these two cultures, hate and competition on the one hand, and collective resistance on the other. There are calls for broad systemic change. We must fight for a society in which racism and violence are no longer profitable, and where refugees and asylum seekers are treated with dignity, and where there are no more Black deaths in custody. The private sector must no longer be allowed to profit from abuse. I urge all of you to consider the role you can play in ensuring this becomes a reality. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Beiruz, for sharing your personal story, but also your insights around, I guess, the collective resistance that needs to be forged against hate and competition. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. We're going to move promptly to the next speaker, who is Dr. Katrina Wallace. So I'll hand over to her.
Thank you, and extremely humbling speaking after Tendai and also Beiruz, you have spoken. So very, very powerful way to start this conversation. And all respect to you, Beiruz, for what you have had to deal with and contend with as a result of the Australian government's approach. So I'm very sorry for that. Now, my area of expertise is actually in the technology that enables a lot of these systems to take place. So my expertise is in artificial intelligence and in machine learning, and I have a company that builds software robots. I also sit on a board of Responsible Technology Australia. I am the founder of Ethical AI Advisory. And so my great interest and concern comes from the fact that AI is the fastest growing technology sector in the world, $38 billion spent in the last 12 months. It'll grow 240% in the next 3 years. Within the next 2 years, 80% of all technologies will be powered by AI. So AI simply is technology that mimics human intelligence and uses advanced logic and analytical techniques in order to be able to do high-level analysis, decision-making, and automation. And machine learning is the ability of these machines to learn on their own accord. Now, the real challenge with machine learning and AI is that the data that's used to train these machines is how they learn to behave in the future. And mostly the data that we already have in the world is full of bias, is full of inaccuracies. And essentially, my view is that we are now coding into machines that will run the world the existing biases that society has. And as I often say, AI can do three things. It makes things bigger, faster, cheaper, and it will break things bigger, faster, cheaper. So if we think about the challenges that we've had by way of discrimination or racial or any other type of bias, now think of that being enabled at scale. That's what we're facing into now. And so what is more concerning, other than the scale of it, is the fact that there are very few laws or regulations that govern or direct or legislate around the use of emerging technologies such as AI. And remembering in thinking about border control, the main technologies that we will see being used in border control or in monitoring or surveilling asylum seekers, refugees, but also involved in the COVID app that the Australian government has released, are highly advanced analytics and predictive capabilities, automation, not so much in the COVID app, but there are facial recognition, computer technology, vision, sensors, drones, and ultimately automated weaponry will be developed and will be available to governments or other parties who are interested in controlling borders or controlling populations. We've already seen AI used with Cambridge Analytica to do mass manipulation of populations around voting and politics, and we should expect to see more and more of this. Now, the absence of regulation, and I put it that the technology sector is about 5 years ahead of where the government and where the law is in being able to really control or regulate this technology. Now, in Australia, for example, there are the Human Rights Commission led by Ed Santow, who is a great champion, and Ed really recognises the threat that artificial intelligence poses to human rights. The Human Rights Commission has set out a number of principles, and there are three big things that they're concerned about, and that is that this technology does observe all international human rights requirements, that number two, that it minimises harm, so that AI-informed decision-making never discriminates. And the third principle the Human Rights Commission is concerned with is accountability, so that the builders of AI or the deployers of this technology actually are accountable and must be open and transparent. And then this rolls into an ethics conversation and the ethical principles that are almost universal now around these emerging technologies and technologies that will power areas like border control. There are 7 main ethical principles. So these are that the emerging tech, or AI in this case, must be built with the human, society and environmental benefits in mind. The second one is AI is built with human-centered values at its core. The third one is it must adhere to privacy and security requirements. Fourth is that it must be fair, it must not discriminate. Fifth is contestability. So if a human or a citizen or a refugee feels that they've been discriminated by an AI-informed machine, then they have the right to contest that. The sixth ethical principle is around transparency and explainability, so that organisation, be it the government, the border control companies, or private sector organisations, must be transparent, which means they must be able to open up their, what we call boxes, open up their machines and be able to show and explain the algorithms, the data, and how the machine actually made the decision. And then the seventh ethical principle is that they must be held accountable. The organisation who's deploying the technology and also the organisation, the vendor who has released, has built it. So there's a great example in the news at the moment around Amazon. So Amazon has gone out on the back of the George Floyd protests and stood with solidarity with the protesters, saying, you know, this is not good. And at the same time, their internal staff have stood up and said, well, hang on a minute, Amazon, we provide a software computer vision technology, facial recognition technology called Recognition with a K, which is used to surveil and to determine activities of criminals, and has been demonstrated to be time and time again to actually be racially biased, discriminating against people of colour. So my great concern is that the tech giants that are running, whether it's the borders or the government or private sector, and there are a handful of them, even these companies don't get this right. And these companies are the ones that I believe need to be held to account. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. Thank you for covering so much of that foundational content on kind of core principles of how to consider human rights and ethics in AI. It's super helpful. We'll move now to our last speaker, Jacinta, and then go to Q&A.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this conversation and be on this panel with all of these amazing speakers. So as was said, my name is Jacinta Gonzalez, and I'm a senior campaign organizer with Mi Gente. I am calling in tonight from Phoenix, Arizona. That has been my home for a couple of years now. But the work that we do as Mi Gente is a national home for Latinx and Chicanx changemakers, takes us across the country. And, you know, a lot of us in Mi Gente, even though we work in a variety of issues and really, you know, strive to be an organization that lives up to its principles of being an organization that is not only pro-Latinx, but is also pro-Black and pro-woman, pro-queer, pro-planet, pro-migrant, pro-undocumented, because we know that our people are all of those things and many more. And so, you know, we kind of came about to start to build out the No Tech for ICE campaign, not because we were heavily informed of tech companies or understood how data brokers were selling our information, but really because our work brought us there. You know, we've been fighting against deportations through the Not One More Deportation campaign and other efforts for over 15 years now. And through that process have really realized how Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, the deportation police here in the United States, the way that they were conducting immigration enforcement was changing, right? And so while 10, 15 years ago, we would see much more ICE going into Latino neighborhoods and using racial profiling to go after people, to then building more and more partnerships with local police departments to try to multiply forces by using local police agents as ways of arresting people and then transferring them over to immigration custody, to then seeing ICE not only use information that was coming from the police and coming from the government, but also private sources of data. And the way that we found out about it was just because people would ask us, how did ICE know that I lived here? How did ICE come to know that so-and-so was my cousin? How did they know that I worked at this place and would travel back and forth from this location every day? And so because we were getting questions like that from our community and understanding that people were landing in deportation proceedings through different ways, we decided to do a big report or do some research into understanding what was happening. And we produced a report called Who's Behind ICE? The Tech and Data Companies Fueling Deportations. And folks can look at it at notechforice.com. And through that, we're basically able to uncover that, you know, on DHS's budget at this point, the Department of Homeland Security, over 15% of it is just data management. And so what we saw is that there is such a lucrative business, not only in building cages, but also in building up the tech and data services that ICE agents need to be able to conduct their enforcement. And because it's housed under the Department of Homeland Security, ICE uses that as an excuse to really get, you know, military grade spyware to go after undocumented people in the United States. And so, you know, we started to understand that there was companies like Amazon Web Services, that was providing the cloud services for all of ICE. There was companies like Palantir that are providing data analytics to the company, to ICE agents, and companies like Thomson Reuters that we would consider a news agency are actually selling bulk data to ICE to be able to track and surveil people. And so as we started to understand what all of these contracts meant, for us, it was important to be able to create a corporate campaign that would bring accountability, because as was discussed earlier, there really are no legal frameworks to kind of be able to rein in this technology. And there is no way to hold agencies like ICE to principles that would protect human rights. These are agencies that are caging children. These are agencies that are violating people. These are agencies that are letting people die in prison with COVID. And so any technology that is given these agencies is just used to further their mission of surveilling, detaining, and deporting people, many times suffering and pain with their lives and destructions of entire communities. So there's no way to kind of have them follow principles and how they use technology, because the way that they conduct their business in and of itself is a violation of people's human rights. And so unfortunately, we've just seen this crisis worsen under COVID. These same companies, Palantir, that is creating, spyware for the planet, is also creating programs to monitor people's health. You can imagine why we are incredibly concerned to know that they're going to have access to people's health records that are who are trying to get services for COVID, right? Latinx communities and immigrant communities are extra vulnerable to the virus. Particularly because they don't have access to the same healthcare systems, because they have the fear of ICE agents, and are more in stable jobs. And so, this type of surveillance and these types of companies having access to health systems just makes them even more vulnerable and makes the crisis even worse in terms of how it's impacting public health. And the crisis is getting even worse because, as was mentioned, right now, there is a huge crisis with policing in the United States and worldwide. The recent protests because of the murder of George Floyd at the hands of police has created new opportunities for policing agencies to push back, right? As communities are saying that we need to spend less resources on police and invest in the needs of communities, police forces are pushing back and actually using it to try to justify more surveillance and bigger budgets. And so we're in the middle of a fight where tech companies are trying to pretend to be race-neutral alternatives or ways of improving policing, where really all that they're doing is aiding and abetting the violent police forces that are coming into our communities to create havoc and destruction. And so there needs to be an analysis that does not position tech as an alternative or something that is going to improve the system, but actually start to look at public health and public safety as the things that they are, which are systems that need to be created to give people their basic human rights and access to services, instead of using policing as an excuse to control communities of color across the globe. So, we have a lot of concern. We see a lot of these issues being connected. The way that one border is starting to be militarized is very quickly replicated in other parts of the world. And so there does have to be a collective analysis of what's going to be happening at borders and how they are using technology and surveillance. COVID is just giving us a small taste of what global crisis can look like. As we're looking at global climate change, we know that there's going to be bigger changes in migration patterns, bigger issues with folks needing to travel across the globe to get to safety. And so these are going to be bigger and bigger issues. And unfortunately, that also means bigger and bigger contracts and more lucrative contracts for these companies. And so if we don't start to push back now and start to raise noise now about what they're doing, they're quickly normalizing their practices in ways that are going to alter the way that we approach policing and approach surveillance. So again, very excited to be part of this conversation because it couldn't come at a more timely moment when we need to address these things.
Thank you so much, Jacinta. That was really insightful. And thanks for drawing the link to the climate crisis as well, and how that is only set to kind of further exacerbate this already very complex context. And also just drawing our attention, I guess, to the militarization of policing, like not just policing at borders, but policing generally. So that's a really important point. So I've got a few questions for the panel. I know we've got some questions coming in from audience members, but I'd just like to start. I have a question for Behrooz to kick us off. I'm interested to hear about, we've heard about all of the potential, the current human rights abuses that are already happening, and also the potential for this to scale up substantially. What would you say to investors who have an influence over companies who might be involved in some of these harms? Sorry, I think you might be on mute, Beiruz. Sorry.
Yeah,
Thank
sorry,
you.
I'm behind
No worries.
technology. Yeah, I think it is a very good question. First, I should mention that some of the actually companies, I'm talking particularly about the companies who were working in Manus and Nauru as a security company and others. They actually they work with the gallery center in Australia too. For example, Wilson security company has actually work in a gallery in the biggest gallery in Melbourne. I forgot the name of the gallery. And also some of the companies work with the universities. You know, in the same time, they were abusing the innocent refugees, and in the same time, they were making money with the universities. And some of the universities were the investors. So how can we understand this? You know, in one side, the universities and the art community are investing. I'm not talking about the simple citizens, you know, I'm talking about the universities. And in other side, in the same time, they are actually torturing people. So I think it is a big question that we look at this. We look at this, that how, where these companies are working, and we should try to really find that who is the biggest investors. You know, we should understand this, how they are connected. And I am sure that now the main reason that the Australian government is keeping people in detention in Australia and in Nauru now, and some in Port Moresby for more than 7 years, the only reason is because those companies are actually supporting the politicians. But there is no system that we investigate this. There is no reason why they keep these people. The companies such as Serco, because they need people to be in detention. It is an industry, it is a business. They need people to be in the detention that they make money, you know? So now that the refugees, the number of refugees are, you know, they say that they stopped the boat, but they are putting the citizens of New Zealand in detention too, the citizen of other countries. And you know why? Because they need people, they need their bodies to be in the detention to make money. So we should, I think, look at this. But there is not a system in Australia to investigate this. Australia is really a corrupt system. At least in this industry, I mean, in detention, this industry is very corrupt system. They wasted $10 billion in Manus Island and Nauru. So I don't think that they spend it for the refugees. Yeah.
Thank you, Beiruz. Yes, thank you for mentioning Serco, obviously a really key player and very relevant to the Black Deaths in Custody conversation as well. I might ask Katrina or Jacinta if you'd like to jump in on that question of, you know, what would you say to investors who might be engaging with these kinds of issues for the first time, either looking at their existing portfolio or kind of looking at new investments? Katrina, do you want to go first?
Yeah, great. So I think my view is this, that at the moment, if government is quite behind actually catching up with these either tech companies or companies like Serco, who are very instrumental in running the borders and issues around the borders. And we're yet to see really strong citizen movements because citizens still aren't really aware of all these issues, either the ones that Beirut or Hinta mentioned, or even that I mentioned about AI. So if government is a bit slow, citizens don't quite know what's going on, then we're really left with the power of the private sector. And on the face of it, it may not appear to profit-driven private companies that doing something that is ethical or good for human rights might actually benefit their bottom line or their shareholders, etc. So when we look at the all the stakeholders, there is actually one group who does have power in this, and it is the investors, because the investors really and the shareholders do determine much of what boards and the operations of these companies can do. So I would say it is incumbent upon investors who are looking to invest in companies, some of which we've talked about, but other companies that are either providing technology or providing operations that have these human rights implications, that they hold the board and the executive to account, that they have ethical and human rights frameworks in mind when they are either procuring technology or building operations or partnering. These should become part of the board's responsibility and most definitely part of a procurement process.
Fantastic. Yeah. No, that's right. I think, and to add to that, Jacinta, could you explain? So Katrina just mentioned how, particularly in the Australian context, I think perhaps the movements around this haven't yet built up. But in where you are, you're very much at the forefront of leading these kinds of movements. So could you maybe describe a bit about how, I guess, some of the work that you're involved with, the organising work, links to some of the more investor-related tactics, I guess, or work? That would be really helpful.
Sure, and to give a little bit of context, because I think it sometimes helps to understand all of the moving pieces, right? ICE as an agency, as an immigration enforcement agency, as a policing agency, has only existed for about the last 15 years. Since about, once the Department of Homeland Security was created after 9/11, that's when it came in. And that's when ICE was sort of conceptualized as a police force to enforce civil immigration law within the interior of the United States. And very quickly, ICE has grown and grown and grown, right? It went from being a couple of thousand agents to now being over 20,000 agents. It went from having just a few thousand people in detention to now having the capacity to have over 60,000 people in detention, both using private detention centers and kind of a mix of local and state agencies. And so what we have seen is a ballooning of policing, right? And then within a very racially charged political context of Donald Trump using immigrants as scapegoats and using them as political pawns in his political discourse. And so you have this heightened racial tension, you have a lot of violence, a lot of xenophobia that is being spewed out from these positions of power, and you have over the last decade or so really built up a police force that is at the hands of the president to enforce immigration law. And so part of the problem here is that there isn't a lot of supervision of these police agents, right? And that there aren't a lot of laws that will kind of hold them accountable. I personally can say I'm a US citizen. I was transferred to immigration custody by ICE agents because they racially profiled me, and I didn't have a legal recourse. Like, there is no way of holding them legally accountable for what they did, even though they know that they violated my rights in this way. And so it's very important to kind of understand that context when we're thinking about this policing agency, because again, when you're thinking about holding them to account, there's no federal legislation to understand how to hold people's data in ways that would actually protect their safety, while at the same time you're increasing policing in this kind of way. And so that's the climate in which investors, but not only investors, but everyone has to make decisions about how they act in this moment. And so that's why we've seen students at universities say, I refuse to work at these companies until they do better. That is why you see workers within these companies start to sign letters and do internal pressure, and many of them quit and walk off the job when they do not believe that the company is doing better. And so what we're starting to see now is a movement of investors starting to do the same and say, we will stand with communities that are standing up on the front lines, and we will also try to do better. So for example, recently Mi Gente partnered with a union in Canada to do a shareholder resolution before Thomson Reuters. And 30% of independent shareholders agreed that any contract with ICE was a human rights liability, and therefore they should make a different types of assessment. And so we're starting to see the shift happen. We're starting to have investors understand the liability of working with these police forces. And we're also starting to get them to understand that until investors stand up and say, we're not going to invest in fossil fuel, we're not going to invest in arms, we're not going to invest in the criminalization of migrants, the things won't change. It's going to continue to be, it's going to continue to be a very, very dangerous situation. And so we need to have everybody do their part.
Thank you. Thank you for kind of explaining, I guess, that broader context. This is a relatively new topic, I guess, for myself and many others maybe joining the call. And so I think it might be helpful if some of you could break down how do these technologies actually work, not just at the borders, but even if we could understand a bit more, how, say, Amazon or data brokers or, companies that collect this and sell this data, how they play a role in this system. So I might start with Katrina, if you could explain a bit more about, even you touched on it earlier, but just even artificial intelligence and data and how it actually works.
Yeah, it's actually, I think, quite simple, and you can break it down into three core parts. So artificial intelligence is, as I mentioned, is the mimicking of human intelligence. So it really is around decision making and automation, but the use of data to train algorithms to do a particular process or action. So if we take that into its simplest categories, there is the data, there are the algorithms, and then there's the decision and or the action that the machine might take. So rigor and ethics and human rights, really principles need to be applied to each of those three categories. But really where it starts is the data first. And where we're seeing all of these companies violate anti-discrimination regulations and coming out with bias results, even the Apple Card and Goldman Sachs providing 20 times more credit to men than to women, Microsoft and The Guardian replacing their journalists with robots that cannot identify mixed race people. It all starts with the data. And what we've really lost is the rigor in organizations to make sure they're buying data sets that have been adequately prepared, cleaned and tested, and the data bias removed. And what is one of the challenges is, what is the incentive for these organizations using this data to do that cleaning and preparation? And that's what we've got to build in. And again, from an investor's lens, that's where I think the investors should put a lot of pressure on. Who's running the data area? Who's procuring it? Who are the companies that they're procuring it from? And what level of quality and cleanliness is in the data? Then there's the algorithms. So the algorithms, we talk about black box and white box AI. Black box is it's so complex that not even the people that have built it, the data scientists, can even understand it, nor can they ever explain it. Because the way machine learning works is that it's constantly consuming data and recognizing patterns that are not normally easily recognizable to a human or to standard analytics packages. And it learns in its own way. So it becomes very, very complicated for humans to then unpack and be transparent about. So we want to look for, I would encourage investors to look for what we call white box AI. And this is certainly the type of AI that I'm involved in, where it's able to be transparent, the algorithms are easy to explain, where a decision has been made by the machine, it's easily explained. And if there is an error or bias in it, then that's easily remedied. So that's the algorithms. And then there's the decision making, either the predictive capability, the decision, or the action or the automation that the machine is going to do. And in there also, we need to start seeing rigor and testing. And what I've encouraged all users of these technologies to do, really this notion of diversity becomes much less just a nice thing to have, but absolutely essential to have diverse teams who are developing this technology and seeing what the outputs are, so that we know that it won't discriminate against particular races. We know it won't discriminate against particular genders. We know it won't make bad decisions. The diversity on the teams that are putting that together is essential. But right now, 90% of the developers of this tech are males, and less than 1 in 10 jobs is held by females in this field. So the problems around the bias is incredibly challenging. Even the outputs of some of these machines, so the decisions and the actions, we know that when AI starts to automate jobs, which will be 1.8 million jobs automated in the next 12 months, 90% of those jobs will be the jobs of women and minority groups that get removed. So from an investor's lens, again, there's these multiple levels that need to be thought about and addressed, but I put them into those 3 buckets: the data, the algorithms, and the action of the machine.
That's super clear. Thank you. And Jacinta, can you kind of build on that and just quickly touch on, for instance, Palantir, Amazon, Thomson Reuters, how they fit into that framework that Katrina's just described?
Sure, knowing that you'll have a lot more expertise than I, Doctor, in terms of being able to lay that out. But I think for us, what's been helpful to understand in terms of what technology is helpful to ICE is that there's kind of different companies that do different things. And so with Thomson Reuters being some of the main data brokers, they're the ones that are kind of going out and casting the wide net, buying different sources of data, be it commercial data, medical bills, police records of different sorts, so also like jail intakes that they can't get any other way. These are sources of information that they're buying from Thomson Reuters, where Palantir is really actually analyzing that information, processing it, using for investigations. For example, when ICE conducted a raid in poultry plants across Mississippi, arresting over close to 700 people, including families, and leaving many children alone without both of their parents. The technology that they used to analyze all of the information to go after the poultry plants, a lot of that came from Palantir Technologies. And then Amazon is really sort of has gotten the FedRAMP authorizations to be able to provide cloud services for federal government agencies to basically make billions of dollars of profit off of being able to provide that type of platform. And we can see that only starting to grow. So as we're seeing them, Amazon starting to say, we are going to stop having recognition technology or have a moratorium on it for 1 year. What they're also not saying is that they have all of these other very lucrative contracts with police departments, including Ring technology to use doorbells as ways of giving information to police departments, and being able to hook up facial recognition technology to that. So there's a bunch of ways that these companies are kind of going around it. There's just one other company that I wanted to sort of highlight is Clearview AI, which is a company that is doing facial recognition technology, but again, using pictures that they've scraped off the internet. So all of these rules that we think, so I can't remember which of the panelists said we're about 5 years behind them. I think we're about like 10 or 15 years behind them, if anything. And it is very scary to actually see some of these technologies start to be used in the field by police officers without any sort of framework, any sort of protections, and really see lawmakers be so unwilling to take it on. When Donald Trump is asking for a border wall, a brick and mortar wall, Democrats are asking for surveillance walls. So we really have a lot of work to do to be able to change the framework.
Thank you, Jacinta. That's a great note to end on. We've run out of time, so I can't have closing remarks from the speakers. I'm really sorry. But what I will do is share with all participants a bit of a summary of this session and some of the resources that have been mentioned. ACCR is going to have more of a focus on this area going forward. So any investors, please do get in touch with us. But I just want to really thank all of the incredible experts we have with us today. So Tendai, who had to leave earlier, Behrooz Bhusani joining us from New Zealand, Dr. Trina Wallace and Jacinta Gonzalez. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time to explain this quite complex intersection between border policing, COVID, and kind of these emerging technologies. So with that, I will leave you all. Thank you.